Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Catholic ReCon, testimonies from reverts and converts. I'm your host, Eddie Trask. And this week's guest is Greg, who I had a fantastic chat with last week. Was it last week, Greg?
It was.
That's how fast these days go. And I'm not going to get into the specifics of the conversation because Greg's going to share his testimony. Greg, as I do with everyone, why don't you take us back to where you think this journey began, where it's relevant? See if we can start there and go down the various paths together.
Sure. So I am technically a cradle Catholic, born into a nominally Catholic family in Quebec, in Eastern Canada. And I went to, I went to Catholic school, which is sort of different back home, certainly in the 80s, 70s and 80s when I was growing up. They weren't private schools. They were more like public school with Catholic flavor. But not involved in the church outside of school. I was baptized. I went through First Communion. I went through Sacrament of Reconciliation. And then I opted out at 11 or 12. I wasn't confirmed. And I sort of, at that point, continued attending Catholic school, but functionally checked out on any relationship with Jesus or just even really a belief in God at that point. I come from a fairly rough background. I'm the survivor of child sexual abuse and child trafficking, pretty deep end of the pool stuff. And that's very much intertwined into my sort of estrangement from the faith and ultimately my return to the faith, and the walkabout that I went on in between. So I'm not sure exactly where you want me to go with this because there's a lot of places. So like just a little bit of some questions might be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first question that comes to mind is when you mention any type of abuse or trafficking, were you aware how do I put this? With such trauma, was it in the future that you were able to realize all of that versus being in the moment and saying, I am fully aware? Do you just shut down and years pass, you don't even know what's happening? If that makes sense.
I think that there's an intuitive awareness, right? But it's not like, it's kind of somatic in your body, intuitive, not a hyper awareness, like in terms of, at the forefront where you can describe and explain things. So I guess the best way to sort of describe the situation is so my sexual abuse began at the age of 3, and I wasn't fully aware of the depth of what was going on until, like, honestly 2017, when which maybe we'll get to that, maybe we won't. But by the age of 7, I was infected. Now I understand. At the time, I didn't realize what was going on, but I was infected with my first STD at the age of 7. That was in the summer of 80. I went for corrective surgery in July of 1980. And that was the 16th. And by that August, there were a couple of really pivotal things in terms of my estrangement. That August was my first suicidal ideation and planning. I had turned 8 by then. My birthday was on the 25th. So the surgery happened a week or so before my birthday, from 7 to 8. And then at some point in the first half or middle of August, first suicidal ideation. And around the same time, maybe just before, maybe just after, I can remember very clearly being in the spare bedroom of our townhome. And I can just just nihilism at such a young age, and just miserable. And I can remember asking, Jesus, if you're real, if you're out there, give me a sign, show me something. and nothing, crickets. And I think that that's the month that I checked out. Like I think I checked out on, I was so wrapped up in just, and it's more than sexual abuse. My family was involved in the trafficking. So there was a lot of lid keeping on, and the way that that was done was through physical and psychological abuse.
For years, I'm assuming? Just
Better part of a decade.
oh my gosh. Okay.
So, so I was like really like in a hell realm a lot of the time, and completely scapegoated. Right now, the surgery at the time that I was like, this is, I guess, germane to the story, is the surgery was explained to me as being, this happened to you because you didn't wipe your butt and you have poor hygiene. And so complete scapegoating, right? And so like, you believe your parents, right? You believe your parents. And it was an HPV infection that led to growths that needed to be removed. And
Sure.
this is not a hygienic issue. HPV is an STD. I know this now, but at the time, so there was just like already internalized self-hatred and accepting of the scapegoating. So everything I got, I deserved, right? And there was no relief at all, whether it was school or whatever. There was kindness in my life in some ways, but there was certainly no evidence for a God, no evidence for a loving Christ at all, right? So I checked out, and I continued going to school. Now that was before my sacrament of reconciliation, which is like, so, right, first communion is first grade, and reconciliation was like third, I believe. And so I went through those things, but we didn't go to church. There wasn't, I don't even think there was ever a rosary in my home, or
Mhm.
certainly, I don't even think there was a Bible. So I didn't grow up with any of that stuff. And I went to Catholic school, and I was a traumatized kid. So was I performing academically? Nope. Right. And so all of the report cards were, does not work up to potential,
Sure.
it's distracted. So my linkages with Catholicism or church were the school, and I was getting beaten over poor performance and stuff, right? So a further wedge between myself and the institution, although I wouldn't like realize that that's what was happening at the time, and most certainly a huge wedge between myself and God.
Yeah. And if I remember correctly, you said during that time that wasn't there a huge Catholic presence in that area?
I was at the tail end of it, like big
Okay.
enough that there were two school boards, right? So there was the public school board that was secular, and then there was the Catholic school board, which was also public, but just run by a Catholic school board.
Got it.
Right? It
Yeah.
wasn't all nuns and priests. But I mean, it was like the property taxes funded it, right? So the parents decided, are we putting our kids in Catholic school, or are we putting them in quote unquote public school? But they were both functionally public schools.
Got
Only
it.
difference was nominal religious education, occasional masses, and some religious instruction.
Got it. Okay.
But like not like a Catholic private school that you would see in America. It's very different. So Quebec was very much culturally a Catholic place, founded by Jesuits. Quebec was sort of explored and discovered, right? And at one point, one of the most Catholic places on the planet. I'm told, and most Quebecers believe, that during the Second World War, when they were looking at relocating the Vatican if things went south, Quebec was going to be where the Vatican was relocated to, just because of the huge amount of Catholic infrastructure. That all started to implode in the 50s and the 60s. I came up in the 70s and the 80s. I'm 51. So I'm the tail end of that. So it was hollowed out. Clearly, my parents didn't go to church. It was already kind of gone. There was just the facade, the architecture, the culture, the cities are named after saints, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of church buildings. And I was born at a hospital called Sacred Heart. right? Run by nuns, and that's all gone now. So I was sort of like the last generation that was that. So it was a very, it was certainly the epigenetics and cultural, like, is I'm Catholic. Like, I come from a world that's, where the soil is kind of like drenched with it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, yeah. But to
You
say
know,
you're Catholic at that point, given your disillusionment, if you were to say that, what would that have meant? Like, I'm Catholic, just a word, cultural, like it's
yeah,
just
it's an
I'm affirming that I
orientation.
believe in a religion, or how would you view that?
More like, I would say, I guess, like cultural peoplehood. And I didn't understand this until the walkabout. Like, when I left the church, I spent time in 10 years deeply involved with Tibetan Buddhism. And then after that, and why I'm in the States, I'm in Southern California, is I got after I came back from Asia, disillusioned with Buddhism, I got involved with Judaism. And I spent, married a Jew, converted multiple times, came to LA to do Jewish, and went to a Jewish university, thought about becoming, anyways. And now in hindsight, I can see the similarities. In Judaism, there's a strong emphasis on peoplehood, this aspect of cultural Judaism, right? Like, it's pedigree, it's all of these things, not necessarily about God. And so I would say that, like, as a Quebecer, for me, without really understanding it at the time, and now being able to see it, though, sort of a peoplehood Catholicism,
Got it.
right? The calendar revolved around, right, Christmas, Easter, not necessarily the feast, but and I grew up very much in a culture where everything was closed on Sundays, right? Last generation, that all ended when I was in my late teens, is when that kind of fell apart. But so, like, the rhythms of life were Catholic,
Got it.
if that makes any sense.
It does. It does. So you were talking about things are not going well at school, obviously, right? Um, so I'm assuming maybe we go to your teen years.
Sure.
Um, what was that like? Obviously you were having horrible thoughts as an 8-year-old.
Yeah.
Were
So
those just getting worse as you entered your teenage years?
sure, I was so yeah. I mean, I was handed, and it's sort of like amplified by choices my parents were making. But by the age of 14, I was living on the streets, um, pretty rough, drugs, violence, all sorts of stuff, and had completely exited any sort of family situation, any sort of Catholicism. It was far, far away from my heart and my mind, even though, like, yeah, I mean, there were still churches and stuff around. Anyhow, and that kind of, I've always had a strong inclination towards. I've never been a materialist. I've always been into the quote unquote spiritual or the religious. And so I think I caught a break, and this was a grace that God gave me, is when everyone else was doing heroin and shooting up, my drug of choice wound up being religion. So, and there's some interesting intersections there. In terms of street life, I came up at a time when, I grew up in the hardcore punk rock scene, street kid scene, not the suburban stuff. Those of us that it was all we had. It wasn't like a lifestyle choice. I lived on the street. And there was a kind of convergence happening between the Hare Krishna scene and punk rock. And there was this thing called Krishna Core that started.
Really?
And, yep.
What?
Yeah. You should talk to Keith Nestor about it. He comes from a hardcore scene too.
Yeah.
And I know you know him. Anyhow, so yeah, so that was kind of like my gateway into this. Has nothing to do with the nene of my Catholic upbringing. And so that was sort of like, we've got the punk rock dovetailing into the metaphysical, right? So that was my introduction and the beginning of what I would call my, like, 20 plus years of spiritual bypassing. And that's a 5-hour conversation, but I went through that, got involved in Buddhism, got very involved in Tibetan Buddhism, which there are multiple schools out of Tibetan Buddhism. There are 4 big ones, and I was involved with what is called Karma Kagyu Buddhism, It's known as the mishap lineage, and
Okay.
very much crazy stuff, which I didn't see it at the time, but that was my draw, was lots of like the stories of the yogis and the violence and the black magic, and them, not the Buddhist practice black magic, but this insanity and lots of craziness, in dealing, like they call themselves mishap yogis, right? And I was very much like, my life was one mishap after another mishap after
And
another,
that's why it was so
right?
appealing to
Right. And
yeah.
the yogi bit meaning like, sort of like turning it into spiritual path, right? So I got into that, and I got very involved with Tibetan Buddhism for the better part of a decade. Wound up being a monastic in the Karma Kagyu tradition.
What does that look like? If you can open that up a little bit.
Well, lots of, lived in a monastery. Was very fortunate to have an extremely now famous Buddhist teacher. And before she was so famous. Anyhow, lots of meditation, lots of stuff around Tantra. So the whole idea behind Vajrayana, which is Tibetan Buddhism, is you don't reject anything, right? It's all part of the path, including like the manure and the violence and the aggression, right? Of what they call samsara, but in Catholic parlance, we just say fallenness. So you don't reject any of it, which I was surrounded by misery. So it was extremely appealing to me to not have to reject it, but lean into it and see it as being like the manure and fertile ground for awakening, right?
Oh, wow.
If that makes any sense.
I think it does. Yeah.
But a lot of broken and dysfunctional people. And as with most Western traditions that make their way, Eastern traditions that make their way west, right? Roots had not been settled. So you have a lot of people in leadership that are pretty messed up. So it all kind of starts to fall apart, and addiction creeps in, and teachers are sleeping with students, and just it wound up being a nightmare. And after about a decade or so of that, I just thought, oh no, this is just horribly broken and messed up.
Wow. So I do have to ask a question. When you say monastic, do these people have full-time jobs and then they retire to these areas? I know nothing about
Right.
it.
Okay. So there are multiple streams, just like in Catholicism, right? There are householders,
Okay.
and then there are monastics,
Yep.
right? And so in the broader community, there are both. So I took temporary ordination. So I was a monk for a set period of time.
Got it.
Most of my time I was out in the world, but I did spend a fair amount of time at Gampo Abbey, the monastery. But so most of the teachers I dealt with, the Rinpoches, especially Kagyu and Nyingmapa tradition, householders, not monks, not like the Dalai Lama at all. Very much like this crazy wisdom vibe,
Okay.
where there's drinking and smoking, and it's all part of the path. Lots of free, like, I mean, but this is coming out of the 70s and the 80s, right? Dealing with that whole sexual liberation energy. So that was just kind of sort of like got imported in and just incorporated into stuff. Horrible idea. A lot of fun at the time, until the damage and the casualties, started popping up. But I mean, as a young person that came from dysfunction, it was extremely exciting.
Yeah, it would be like an organic transition into,
Yep.
yeah, you were saying you were not a materialist and you have
Right.
a spiritual concept, but there's still some chaos, still some dysfunction.
Yep.
Yeah.
Lots of play, and also room for the trauma to play out. And I didn't understand that at the time, right? And there's no rejecting of it, right? There was no rejecting of it. So that kind of faded away. I went and spent a year in Asia. And when I came back from that, I got really I was completely disillusioned. And wound up finishing college, and I wound up working and out of college. And I met a girl who was a Jew. And she was like, if you're going to date me, you're going to need to learn about Judaism. And so I said, okay. And I grabbed a couple Hasidic books on God. And that relationship did not last, but those books changed my life. I have been able to relate to Christ as a rabbi, or even kind of at phases as kind of like the Buddha, an enlightened teacher. But just in terms of icon, in terms of meaning, this whole idea of the cross and the crucifixion, it was so inaccessible to me. So, and I guess I was never able to separate God from that until I got to the Hasidic stuff. And then I had an access point where I could start to have a exploration of God with no need to deal with the dude up on the cross. Right.
Oh, okay.
So I was like, okay, great. This is great. I get God and I don't have to deal with Jesus. If that makes any sense.
That does, yeah.
So I converted in Canada, met an American through organizations that I was involved with, did long distance dating, and there's a huge spiritual bypassing component in here, because both of those things was me trying to get the Buddhism and the Judaism. There's an underlying current of me hating myself and trying to reinvent myself and kill the broken person that gave himself didn't wipe his butt, right? Like that person, let's erase that person, right?
And so you can't have the incarnation, like you're saying. You can't deal with the cross. You can't have the incarnation if you're trying to do what you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
Spiritual bypassing, complete trauma response. So, moved here, got engaged, moved here, married an American Jew, came to LA specifically to do Judaism, got into the Jew brotherhood as quickly as I could, became extremely observant, orthopraxic, but progressive.
Okay.
And started to cultivate a relationship with God, or trying to, but mostly reinventing myself, right? Abandoning my family, abandoning my country of origin, taking on a Jewish name, taking on Jewish cultural customs, right? Jewish dress, Jewish observance. So that's why I say orthopraxic was, I will do these things because these are things that the broken, traumatized not understanding that that's what was happening at the time, but that's what I was doing. Yeah. So it's very much a trauma response, very much classical, like spiritual bypassing, drug of choice. And so I did that for the better part of a decade. And then I started having flashbacks around abuse. And I had always known about the tip of the iceberg of the abuse. 3 particular incidents, a lot of stuff, like I said, the surgery, the STD, had blocked that out by that point. But in 2014-ish, there were 2 TV shows. There was The Americans, which was about Russian spies in America in the 80s with that had a family. They were like a plant fan, I don't know if you remember this show, but the set and children and the music and the clothing and the haircuts, all stuff from my youth. And I started it started triggering memories, right? Whoa. And then a little bit later, I only watched the first season, but the Stranger Things, right? Also set at the time where my stuff was falling apart in the 80s.
Yeah.
And you've got the music, you've got the set pieces, you've got the clothing, you've got the haircut, and you've got kids. So it started just popping up. I started having really intense flashbacks about the stuff I remembered, winding up in the ER, needing Valium drips, and just losing my crap. And so in the fall of 2015, my now ex-wife and I decided to fly back to Canada to file criminal complaints against, in 3 jurisdictions, against 3 sets of people. And at this point, I knew a fraction of what was going on in terms of the trafficking. My mother was playing dumb, got involved, helping, quote unquote. And so I flew back to Canada and spent 9 weeks there filing complaints, which led to 3 criminal investigations, 1 person being charged. Okay. And so then almost a year to the day later, so we flew out on December 25th, 2015, and we flew into Ottawa from LA. And on the 23rd of 2016, things were rolling around with the investigations. I wasn't remembering more stuff. I was in a good place, and I decided to, I don't know if I should say this, but I will. So I wound up going, all right, I'm going to do a healing ceremony, live in LA, right? So 5 grams of high grade psilocybin. And when I was coming down, I got hit by, I asked a question. I said, like, why would this happen to me? And it was because you could handle it, it is the message that I got. And then it said, and by the way, there's a lot more, and your father's involved. And I got hit with a tunnel of light where there was lots of abuse flying by me, but I didn't know what it was. Okay. And I can remember my wife coming out, and I was trying to tell her, there's more. And she's like, you're just tripping, just relax. Anyways, that was on the 23rd of December, 2016. By the first week of January, I remembered the surgery. And I was like, oh, this is not right. My butt. This is surgery on my butt. And so I confronted my mother over that. I called her up and I said, why don't you tell me a little bit about the surgery? And she lost her stuff, like lost it. At which point I was like, oh, this is not good. Because like, you know, we went from like, I can remember them sitting me down and saying, you did this to yourself. You don't wipe your butt. This is why this happened. That story was gone. Her voice went up like a cajillion octaves, which is her tell, and she sounded like a 5-year-old. And so now I know you've seen the redacted version of the pathology report. So fortunately or unfortunately, the hospital that I was treated at, and this is a whole can of worms that we probably can't get into, but they're a teaching hospital. So the medical records are never destroyed. They're never put away. They're kept forever and ever and ever. So when I was like, I'm calling Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario in Ottawa, and I'm like, I need my records. This happened, and I need you all to explain it to me. So by February, I had 200, and there's a lot more stuff that I haven't even gotten into on Twitter yet about the story. There's more, but I received about 200 pages worth of medical records and Child Protective Services records, all sorts of stuff I blocked out. Nightmare, like nightmare, movie level nightmare stuff. And what became very clear, because I had half a dozen doctors, including people at Cedar Sinai in Beverly Hills, look at documentation. They're like, this is HPV. This is an STD. There's only one way this happens to you.
Yeah.
And at which point it became, I started piecing together more and more of it. And there were 3 trips taken to Europe and the States, and like, it gets crazy.
How were you dealing with learning all of this at once? Not all at once, but
a lot of high grade LA weed.
Really? Okay. Yeah.
You
So
know,
you're making
and
all
just
these
numbing out in
points
every single possible way.
And you're like, how the heck am I going to stay numb? Or
just trying to process it. And I'm not equipped to process this stuff. And I was mad and revenge and and still working. And now there's a man that's been charged. There's 2 trials set up, right? And I'm going, oh, there's way more happening here, and they're involved. And my mother's a witness in this trial. This stuff's going to go south anyways. So now, a lot I could get into, but what brings it to the reversion story is I found out in February of 2017, I got the pathology reports, the medical report, all of the stuff. And by June of that year, I was such a hot mess that I needed to, I didn't need to, I went in voluntarily, but I needed to go into a trauma unit. And this is where the reversion starts. I'm a Jew. I'm married to a Jew. I'm living the life as a Jew, right? When all of this is happening. So I get referred to a hospital called NTC, the National Trauma Center, run by a guy from Canada who now lives in Austin, a psychiatrist. His name is Colin Ross. And I did not know any of this when I went there, but his area of specialty is satanic ritual abuse and dissociative identity disorder, and sort of where the two mix.
Okay.
And so I wound up spending 3 months in that trauma unit, surrounded by, there's no SRA in my life, which is the abbreviated form of satanic ritual abuse, but I was around female survivors that had undergone severe, or claimed to have undergone severe SRA, and were suffering from horrible DID, dissociative identity. We're talking, some of these women had 20 and 30 alternate personalities.
Oh, that's what you mean by DID. Okay, got it.
Right. What used to be called multiple personality is now referred to as dissociative identity disorder. And there's a connection between trauma-based mind control and SRA and DID.
I mean, in short, your brain is just trying to escape, and it creates these alternate realities?
You fragment your personality in order to get out of it. And so you have these completely disintegrated personalities that take shape.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
And so, anyways, and I went in there not believing in the devil, because I'm a Jew, right? There's no Christian devil in Judaism. It's very different. And certainly, while I was orthopraxic, I was fairly progressive, and I would say that I was not a materialist, but I was like, like devil as archetype, sure, no problem.
Yeah.
Okay, but SRA, no, delusion, crazy stuff. I grew up with Geraldo and the Satanic Panic talk show stuff, right? So it's like Satanic Panic. So, but I spent 3 months there, and by the time I left, there's no way all these people were making everything up. It was impossible, in my opinion, that all, like, just the stuff that I saw there, and the way that Colin Ross could, like, just puppet master, pull personalities out, and the stories and the levels of self-injurious behavior that these women would, just the damage that they would do to themselves when certain personalities would kick in. I left there. SRA is real, at least some of the time, no question about it. And the devil's real. The devil's real. So not only is the devil real, but I started looking at the evil and the vileness in my life, and I'm going, oh, I had a target on my back, and I'm like, no satanic stuff, but the devil targets the youth. I mean, 1 Peter 5:8, right? I'm like, the devil's real. So I started crawling my way back to Christ, to the church, because I was trying to outrun the devil. So the way that sort of played out, and that would have been October of 2017. October, November 2017. And within a month of being out of the hospital, I'm separated. I'm shacked up with one of the DID ladies from the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And I relocate out of LA to Santa Clarita, which is where I am now. And I started crawling my way back. And the way I sort of did it psychologically was, first, well, devil's real, God's real, and the Christian devil is real. It's not like some just adversary, right? Fallen angels. It all starts to make sense. Then Christ up on the cross makes a lot more sense, right? The psychological malfunction or blockage that kept me from seeing Christ as anything other than like the Buddha type figure giving the Sermon on the Mount, right? The Beatitudes. It's like, oh, now coming down, incarnated, being the sacrifice, dying on the cross, being resurrected, it all made sense, right? Like in a visceral first person direct experience kind of way, not like a theological proposition, like reality.
Wow.
Like, and it was horrifying. It was horrifying because so in the span from 2017 to 2018, right, I completely found out that my life was a lie, like my childhood was a lie, that I had been trafficked in horrible ways and things had been done. I lost the only stable relationship of my life. I lost the last 10 years of stability as a Jew, if you can call it that. The self-medicating stopped working, right? In terms of the Judaism. And as an only child, I found out that my parents were the primary actors in my sexual abuse and trafficking. Right? So in a very Job sort of way,
Everything's taken. Yeah.
everything is taken away. So I came out, I was in a relationship with insanity, and all I know is crazy and insanity, and I'm running with it, and there's fun, there's fun to it. But I'm trying to work it out. And I get hooked up with, I call a priest here locally, and I explain my situation. He's like, well, you're not possessed, because I wanted to rule it out. You wouldn't be calling me, but it sounds like oppression. And he hooked me up with some people, and that got me involved in some conversations around deliverance ministry.
I have to ask you this. Why a priest? Why did that come to your mind? You
Because
just
I'm
thought
Catholic.
well,
Right, but like muscle memory.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Like who and like, I mean, growing up, like living in Hollywood, growing up with movies, who do you call demonic, like, right?
Yep.
Problems.
Yep.
You call a priest.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I've said this before, but I'll continue to say it. So many anti-Catholic claims where they're talking about the demonic, and I'm like, who do you call when you want exorcism? What do you think these men do that have been given an indelible grace? Anyway, go ahead.
So, and that's how that happened, and I'm trying to work it out. And so I got involved with some stuff, and there's a lot of details, but we're getting tight on time. So what I'll say is, like, so I'm like, the one connection that got made during this that became really clear was, there's a reason that I wasn't confirmed at the age of 11 or 12. And my view of it is I got hardcore 1 Peter 5:8, into not, just all of the devil wanted me far away. Devil did not want the blessings and the gifts of the Holy Spirit descending upon me. And so the causes and conditions and the cards were stacked for a particular direction, and I bit the hook, right? And I wasn't confirmed. And this became absolutely confirmed a little bit later, because I finally got out of that relationship with the woman, and decided a couple months later, got out of the bad habits, a lot of the bad habits around psychedelics and whatnot, because I went pretty deep in for there was a couple year period of time. And I was like, all right, I need to get, at that point, it was just course correction. I need to get confirmed. He didn't want me to get confirmed. I need to get confirmed. So I found a confirmation program out here in Santa Clarita, and I got enrolled in it. And and the devil messed with me during the process. Within 3 weeks of me being in that class, it turns out that the house I was renting a room from was actually foreclosed. It was a squat. The woman didn't own it. And I wound up we all got kicked out by the sheriff's department, eviction notices. So I wound up being homeless. Well, I mean, not on the street homeless, crack motel homeless.
Oh, wow.
Which is not great, right? But to the credit of the woman who ran the program, who became my confirmation sponsor and is my godmother at this point, she made sure that, and this was on the upside, we're doing Zoom because this is during COVID. So I was able to attend classes. I missed stuff. She got me to and from. She made sure I didn't disappear, and so I made it through that, and I wound up getting confirmed in Easter of 2021, just a couple years ago. And I expected it to be just a ceremony and not much to it. And I wasn't looking forward to it because it's a huge parish. There were a gazillion kids on top of the adult confirmation people, and I was dreading it. And I went in, and it turns out I was the very first person to be confirmed, just the way it worked out. So I went up, I did the show, and I was done with the show part within 10 minutes. And I came back down and I sat in the chair, and all of the the pressure of performing disappeared. And I did not have the vocabulary to describe what was happening to me at the time, but what I experienced was like straight up baptism in the Holy Spirit. Okay. I was crying for the next 70 minutes straight. I was not expecting any of this. A full range of emotions. I could feel this just love raining down on me.
Wow.
Right. And I'm not that guy. I'm so not that guy. And I just cried. And it was super hyper emotional for me. And it took another year for me to sort of figure out, close to a year. I'm like, I came across a book and I'm reading about it, and they're describing baptism in the Holy Spirit. And I'm like, oh, this is exactly what happened to me. Like, this lines up. And I mean, the catechism, it's SoCal, it's a suburban parish. We didn't go into the gifts coming down and all of the theological, mystical aspects of what is supposed to happen during confirmation, and how it's the conclusion spiritually of what starts with baptism. So I didn't know that's what was happening, but it was like very much baptism in the Holy Spirit. And I was home.
Wow.
Right. And there were challenges after that, but that's what led to the reversion, or the conclusion of the reversion. And certainly there have been, I would say, demonic entanglements at the level of oppression, that led into that. Like I said, the homelessness and more. I mean, there's more stuff, but that's what brought me back. And so it's been just sort of like clearing out the debris and figuring out what it means to live authentically as a Catholic. But I guess the important point for me is had I have not gone to NTC, that trauma center, had I not have been with those people that were survivors of SRA, none of this would have happened. I'd probably be dead now, or I would have murdered somebody.
Believable. So you're saying, because in that, it's not a ward, right? In that unit, right? Call it whatever you want, right?
Yeah.
You saw evil from a different perspective, and
well, the Christian narrative played out as being true, not like a not an argument, right? Not like apologetics, not theological framing. I saw the fall out of the devil messing with people. And I began to be able to unpack that and see how I was also a victim in a much lighter way compared to these people. No SRA.
Well, it's funny, the gentleman I just interviewed last week, when he described, when he looked up and it was pitch black. The way he was describing it, I'm like, oh my gosh. And I've heard other people say they saw how dark it could be. This wasn't his story, because you remember he said the psychedelics actually led to him seeing color.
Yeah.
And then he came out of it. But anyway, I've heard a number of people say that. Why I came to the faith, I was atheist. I saw how dark things are. I saw how evil things are. And I knew intuitively there was a counterpoint to what I just witnessed. And I just sense that when you say that, I'm like, oh my goodness.
The counterpoint is Christ as incarnation, his suffering and his crucifixion and his resurrection. right? It's not like a compelling argument in the abstract.
Yep. Genesis
It's a
3:15.
visceral lived experience, and it is horrifying. It was horrifying and terrifying.
Yeah.
Horrifying and terrifying. But that was ultimately what brought it back. And it's interesting that God can use any evil for his good and his plan. And that has really played itself out in my life. Well, has begun to it. No, it has played itself out in my life.
Well, you can say redemptive suffering and not say, well, it's all finished. You are working out redemptive suffering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Things are still unfolding. But most certainly, just in terms of the ministries that I'm involved with and the rain of blessings that have come in my way over the last year, everything I do is trauma meets the cross. Okay. Everything I do is trauma meets the cross. I only really relate to and am comfortable around other abused pit bulls.
Okay.
Right. Like myself. I'm 51. I'm not going to be a normal dude. Like, and I'm not like, I mean, what brings me to Christ and what brought me back into the fold of the Catholic Church is outlier stuff. I'm not special. It just doesn't happen a lot. You know, it doesn't happen a lot. Most of the people who hear my story, if they haven't walked a mile or anything near to my shoes, right, they're normally, it's a hard pill to swallow. The thing that I have going for me, or else people would think, oh, he's delusional, is I'm so well documented. You can't argue with the pathology report.
Yeah. Yep.
You can't, like, and a ton of other stuff.
Yep.
Right. Like I'm too well documented to be put into the like QAnon conspiracy crazy like sort of bucket.
I was going to talk to you about that with the Sound of Freedom. It's like, here's a story about how real trafficking is, and to pin an actor in the movie as, you know, QAnon adjacent film because of an actor. It's the most ridiculous pile of crap I've ever heard in my life.
Okay,
in an effort to stifle the most heinous garbage that's going on.
I want to be more charitable and say that there's a cognitive dissonance, and it is so evil that people like, yes, there are people that are doing exactly what you're saying, but the average Joe and Jane, it can't be real. It can't be this bad.
I meant the reviews. I meant the reviews that specifically try to diminish. I mean, diminish the
and Rolling Stone. And that's kind of what made that post where why I posted the anniversary about the surgery, was because those two articles pissed me off.
Yeah.
And what I did was, as soon as I saw them, I went and said, yeah, fictitious. Here's something from 1980. Here's a pathology report. And I just posted it, you know, tell me I'm making it up, right? Tell me this is just conspiracy theory.
Yeah. And that's what's so important to talk about it, because what I'm getting from you, you can talk about this. Okay. What you're doing is bringing things into the light, right?
Yes, sir.
The unspeakable things brought to the light in an effort to shine light for other people.
God has a plan. I can't be discredited as merely crazy. I could be 50% wrong, but I'm definitely 50% right. I have the receipts.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely important. And that's why I wanted to talk to you about it. I mean, the other thing that is important with redemptive suffering is, and I've interviewed a few people like this, they're able to go back, talk about something that is traumatic without staying in that place. You're, again, I have to say it, you know, shining light without saying, I'm a perpetual victim. You can talk about the trauma and then say, I'm using this to go help other people, other brothers and sisters, others that are disillusioned. And I think you talked to me about that. Not just, hey, let me go find other pseudo-Catholics. You're dealing with as you said, trauma meeting the cross. You want people to find the cross.
Healing.
You're not approaching saying, here's why the Catholic Church is true. You're saying, let's talk about Christ and his love for you, right? Is that the message?
It is very much the message. And it's not that I don't think the church is true. It's like, it is the fullness.
Yep.
Okay.
It's
But
steps.
right, but absolutely. For people, there are so, why would you trust God if you were molested by your grandfather, your father, your mother, whoever? And I, cannot in good conscience personally be like, no, you've got to do it the way I'm doing it. I just want people to understand it. The profundity of your suffering, right, is evidence that evil is real. And that evil, right, the resolution, the way through it is to be, you can't get around it, but Christ will walk you through it. And that tweet that went viral, 250,000 or whatever it is, impressions, is Christ is an option. I just want, like, he was not an option for me, right? In terms of course, he's always an option, but the participatory part on my end to be able to see it as an option was not there until I was in the thick of understanding the depravity and the truth of fallenness, right? And that could make you go nuts and just go complete nihilism and revenge or self-termination. And these are things I struggle with. But it's also a vehicle, like it's a doorway into Christ, because all of a sudden, if you've tasted the devil and what he can do, then Christ on the cross starts to make sense, and Christ ceases to just be like a rabbi, a dude with some cool beatitudes.
Yep. And when you receive grace and you open your heart to him, you know how you were saying when you called out, when you cried out, when you were 7 or 8 and you didn't get a response? Well, now I think back, he said 70 minutes or whatever it was of crying decades later.
That was the resolution
of, yeah.
Absolutely.
Beautiful. Now, in the remaining minutes, is there anything else you want to say about what you do? And I mean, I think we covered it, but if there's anything else you can talk about there, and the importance of evangelization for anyone that is called to bring people or to have people, how do I put it? You help people open their eyes to Christ.
That's the hope.
Yeah,
and certainly hope. Like in the small mission field that I inhabit right now, and I am involved in with several ministries here locally around stuff, is I'm trying to bring a sensitivity and an understanding. I'm able to articulate things that a lot of people can't just because of the experience, right? I have eyes to see things that some other people can't. And there's legitimacy. When a person hears my story, it's not me, like, if they have a similar story, right, walls go down, right? Because I'm not talking at them, right?
Yep.
We have a shared lived experience
around
child trafficking or incest, whatever the case may be.
Whatever it is, yep.
Right. So I'm kind of entering the phase of I'm at a transitional period right now where I believe like I'm fully coming back into the fold of the church. And there's more to be said about that, but my healing is not complete, but I'm at a place where I've done enough healing, and I think God is now opening up doors where it's gonna be more helping other people. It has started, but it's going to go more in that direction.
Yeah.
Right. So the one thing I do want to say that in terms of my own healing that has been in terms of a Catholic context, and other people's mileage will vary with this, is the thing that has changed my life the most in terms of praxis or devotion is the divine mercy. And I just want to say, like, if you're struggling with any of the stuff that I've struggled with, read up and consider the divine mercy devotion, the chaplet, because it has a real healing quality. It's very much about suffering and grace and finding it. And just the chaplet, to be able to kick back and say, like, for the sake of his sorrowful passion, have mercy on us and on the whole world, right? There's a dissolving of boundary between self and other. So the us is like good guys, the white hats, the me, the people like me. And the others also includes the abusers,
Yep.
the molesters, the
Wow.
people who stood back,
Wow.
right? And so there's a really powerful transformational, and maybe this is like a bit of a Buddhist hangover, I don't know, right? Like in terms of this component of working with not rejecting anything and bringing it all into the healing. But the divine mercy has been completely life transforming for me. I would not still be, I would have probably bailed and gone either like completely lapsed or Protestant if it wasn't for the divine mercy. Is the thing as a devotion that keeps me grounded and centered and has been the most healing.
Well, you nailed it. You absolutely nailed it. So you're thinking of your enemies, but you're also praying for others' enemies. So it's that communal aspect. We cannot forget that, because we have been, all of us have been enemies of other people.
Yep.
And if you've said that you're too, that someone is too far gone, well, then how are you not too far gone? We have to pray for everyone. And that is a Christian, I mean, clearly the core of the Christian message is, you love those who love you. Okay.
And I understand that there are people who are skeptical of Faustina and the devotion, but I will say from personal experience, it has healed me more than anything else in terms of, prayer.
Sure.
Like I don't want to I don't want to like say that this is more important than like Eucharist or confession, which it's an integrated sort of thing, and they all kind of play off each other and reinforce. But in terms of my heart softening and letting go of some of like just the depraved aggression and hatred, because I have every reason to want people dead, right? This has been such a transformative thing for me.
Well, yeah, you said that as well. A devotion that did something very remarkable for someone, and in no way takes away from any of the sacraments.
Yeah.
If anything, it heightens the sacraments,
Yeah.
because you
It's
realize
an
that
integrated thing that kind of play off each other.
they work together, all the devotions. And again, people that worry about, what should I do? I'm new to the Catholic faith. What should I do? Should I do this devotion? I'm like, let the Holy Spirit guide you.
Yep.
The Lord has provided such a depth to the church that just open your heart and be led. It's what I say, instead of worrying about, well, it worked for him, maybe this is my ticket. It's like, just relax, just pray and open your heart, and you'll find that specific thing that the Lord wants you to pursue. So wow, Greg, fantastic, brother. Fantastic. I appreciate it. To say that you're courageous is an understatement, and anyone else that is willing to be out there, be willing to discern, be willing to, like I said to gentlemen last week, I'm sorry, all these names are blurring
I
together,
know, I can't
right?
keep up. The ex-Satanist dude, who was great, by the way.
Yes, David, is the transparency that we need. Absolutely. That's so fundamental to a testimony. It's like, open up, share it. Other people, they jump on, they often say, thank you for just being willing to speak. So again, kudos to you, and everyone that's watching, please share, subscribe, all the other things, and please pray for everyone that was mentioned during this, and those that you think of in your lives that you would call enemies. We are called to pray for all of them. And until next time, take care and God bless.